Brad Pitt playing the world's greatest warrior. A $185 million budget. The most legendary war in human history. And Hollywood managed to gut the most interesting parts. Brian Cox's Agamemnon gets stabbed inside Troy. Every single ancient source has him surviving, sailing home, and getting murdered by his own wife in his bath. That story is so much better that Aeschylus wrote a trilogy about it. Wolfgang Petersen had a chance to set that up. He threw it away. The gods don't appear in this film, not once, but in Homer's Iliad. The actual source material, a Greek warrior named Diomedes stabs Aphrodite in the wrist, stabs Ares in the stomach, and then chases Apollo across a battlefield until Apollo physically shoves him back. That scene is in the book. The movie cut the entire divine dimension and called it a sophisticated creative choice. And here's the darkest irony of all, the one thing every single person knows about Troy. The Trojan horse is not in Homer's Iliad at all. Hollywood kept the myth that wasn't original and buried the myths that were. I'm going to tell you what the film got right. I'm going to tell you what it got wrong. And I'm going to tell you the real stories. The ones buried under $185 million of spectacle. Because they are so much stranger and more violent and more human than anything that made it to the screen. Let's be fair. Because if we're going to tear this film apart, we need to acknowledge what it gets right. And there's more than people give it credit for. Hector and Achilles. The face-off at the Scaean Gate, the chase, the final duel. Eric Bana's Hector is the beating heart of this film, and his death at Achilles' hands broadly follows Homer. Achilles kills him, ties his body to a chariot, and drags him back to camp. Homer describes this as a grave violation of the ancient code of honor, and the film captures that moral weight. The scene where Priam, disguised as an old man, crosses enemy lines in the dead of night to beg Achilles for his son's body. That's in the movie, and it's one of the most powerful moments in the Iliad. Peter O'Toole delivering that scene. That's real. Achilles withdrawing from battle because Agamemnon steals Briseis. Accurate. His grief and rage when Patroclus dies. Accurate in spirit, even if the relationship is completely rewritten. The Greek beach camp. The sense of a prolonged, grinding siege. That's right, the fog of a siege that's gone on too long, the psychology of men who've been fighting for years. The movie gets the texture, even when it compresses the timeline to about 2 weeks. Odysseus. Sean Bean's Odysseus is intelligent, resourceful, politically savvy. Exactly as Homer draws him. The film's best decision is giving him that quality consistently. And the Trojan horse itself, whatever its source, is executed dramatically well. So yes, the film has real virtues. But here's where I need you to stay with me, because what Troy got wrong isn't just a few facts here and there. It's not the kind of inaccuracy where you go, well, they had to compress it. It's a systematic stripping of the story's actual engine. The gods, the 10 years, the fates of characters after Troy, the nature of the most important relationship in the whole poem. The film took a tragedy and turned it into an action movie. Here's what they buried. Wolfgang Petersen made a deliberate decision to remove the Greek gods from Troy. The reasoning, as he explained it in interviews, was this: a modern audience won't buy gods walking around on a battlefield. It would tip the film into fantasy. It would undermine the realism. I'm going to argue that this decision didn't just change the tone. It removed the central organizing principle of the entire poem. In Homer's Iliad, the gods are not distant figures watching from the clouds. They are active participants in the war with personal stakes, personal grudges, and personal favorites. And I don't mean this metaphorically. They bleed. Here is what actually happens in Book 5 of the Iliad, a book the film skips entirely. A Greek warrior named Diomedes is on an extraordinary rampage through the Trojan lines, killing men so fast that the Trojans don't know what to do with him. The goddess Athena has granted him a special ability. He can see the gods walking among the soldiers. Aphrodite comes down to the battlefield to protect her son Aeneas. Diomedes chases her, catches her, and drives his spear through her wrist. Aphrodite screams, her immortal blood. Homer calls it ichor. Pause from the wound. She drops Aeneas and flees the battlefield weeping, borrowing Ares' chariot to get back to Olympus. On Olympus, her mother Dione comforts her and tells her, "The man who fights the gods does not live long." Then Ares himself, the god of war, comes down to fight for the Trojans. Diomedes, with Athena as his charioteer, drives straight at the god of war and buries his spear in Ares' side. Ares' bellow of pain shakes the battlefield. He retreats to Olympus, furious, and complains to Zeus, who responds by basically telling him he deserved it. That scene, a mortal man stabbing the god of war and the goddess of love in a single afternoon, is not a fantasy tangent. It is the Iliad's argument about the nature of war. The gods are capricious, childish, easily wounded, and playing with human lives as if they're pieces on a board. The humans who die by the thousands are caught between divine politics they had no say in. The tragedy of the poem is inseparable from this. By removing the gods, Petersen removed the theological dimension. The question of whether any of this is these humans' fault at all. Achilles and Agamemnon are caught between a god who hates one side and a god who loves the other. Remove the gods and you have a dispute over a woman and an ego. Keep the gods and you have something genuinely cosmic. The Iliad opens not with Helen, not with Paris, not with Achilles. It opens with the wrath of Apollo. A Trojan priest named Chryses has a daughter, Chryseis, who was taken as a war prize by Agamemnon. Chryses asks for his daughter back. Agamemnon refuses and humiliates him. Chryses prays to Apollo, who responds by sending a plague that kills Greeks in the hundreds for 9 days. This is why Agamemnon is eventually forced to give Chryseis back, and why, to compensate himself, he takes Achilles' prize Briseis, which is what starts the central conflict of the poem. Apollo causes the entire plot of the Iliad. He then personally guides the arrow that will eventually kill Achilles. He physically saves Aeneas from death, teleports him to safety, and leaves a phantom copy of Aeneas' body on the ground for the Greeks to keep fighting over. When Hector finally stops running from Achilles and turns to fight, it is Athena who deceives him, disguising herself as his brother, convincing Hector he has backup, and then vanishing, leaving him alone against Achilles. Hector doesn't just lose because Achilles is stronger. Hector loses because a goddess switches sides mid-fight. The film made Achilles a brooding Brad Pitt who wants glory. Homer made Achilles the mortal caught between his mother's prophecy, Apollo's wrath, and Athena's favor. Those are completely different stories. Agamemnon does not die in Troy. In every ancient source, Homer's Odyssey, Aeschylus's Orestia, Pindar, Euripides, Agamemnon survives the fall of Troy, sails home to Greece, and gets murdered by his own wife. And that story is so dramatically rich, so layered with betrayal and revenge and consequence, that the ancient Greeks wrote about it for centuries. Here's what actually happened. Before Agamemnon ever sailed to Troy, he was already living under a generational curse. His father Atreus had murdered his own nephews, cooked them, and served them to their father Thyestes at a dinner party. That level of family dysfunction has consequences. When the Greek fleet gathered at Aulis to sail for Troy, the winds wouldn't blow. The seer Calchas told Agamemnon the reason. He had accidentally killed a deer sacred to the goddess Artemis, and she was now becalmed the fleet. The only way to get favorable winds was to sacrifice his daughter, his own eldest daughter, Iphigenia. Agamemnon told his wife Clytemnestra that Iphigenia was going to be married to Achilles. She sent the girl to the harbor for her wedding. When Iphigenia arrived, she was led to the altar and killed as a sacrifice. Clytemnestra never forgot. For 10 years while Agamemnon was at Troy, Clytemnestra planned. She took a lover, Aegisthus. She ran the kingdom, and she waited. When Agamemnon finally came home, victorious with a Trojan princess named Cassandra as his war prize and concubine, Clytemnestra was standing on the steps to greet him. She laid out a purple carpet for him to walk on. She invited him inside. She drew him a bath. And while he was in the bath, she wrapped him in a net so he couldn't move his arms, and she stabbed him to death. Then she killed Cassandra. Then she and Aegisthus ruled Mycenae. That is the story of Agamemnon. It involves a murdered daughter, a decade of patient revenge, a purple carpet that may be the origin of the modern red carpet, and a death in a bathtub that sparked a trilogy Aeschylus considered his masterpiece. Wolfgang Petersen had Brian Cox stab him in Troy, in a crowd, like a secondary character. The film also kills Menelaus, Helen's husband. In combat with Hector, in every ancient source, Menelaus survives the war, takes Helen back, and they reconcile. The Odyssey shows us Menelaus and Helen, years later, living peacefully in Sparta, still wealthy, still together, receiving visitors. Helen pours a pain-killing drug into the wine to help people forget their grief. They are fine. The film needed dramatic deaths. It sacrificed the real stories to get them, and the real stories were better. In the film, Paris survived. He escapes Troy with Briseis. There's a sense that he gets away with it. In the actual mythology, Paris does not escape. During the final stages of the war, he is struck by a poisoned arrow, fired by a Greek warrior named Philoctetes, and wounded fatally. He goes to the mountain nymph Oenone, a woman he had abandoned years earlier to pursue Helen, begging her to heal him with her magical abilities. She refuses. He dies of the wound. She, overcome with guilt and grief, kills herself. That's Paris' ending. The man whose vanity started a war that killed thousands dies rejected by the woman he abandoned to chase Helen. There's an entire tragedy in that story. The film didn't tell it. Re-hook. The deaths are wrong. The divine dimension is gone. But the deepest wound this film inflicts, and the most deliberate one, is to the relationship at the center of the entire poem. In the 2004 film, Achilles and Patroclus are cousins. Achilles is the older warrior. Patroclus is the young protege. Their relationship is warm, but clearly framed as familial. Wolfgang Petersen explained this choice directly in interviews. He didn't want to deal with the controversy of a gay relationship. He wanted the film to be accessible to wide audiences. Let's talk about what he was avoiding. Homer's Iliad never explicitly states that Achilles and Patroclus are lovers, but it also never states they aren't. And what the text does say is extraordinary. When Achilles hears that Patroclus is dead, he collapses. He pours ash on his head. He pulls out his own hair. He falls to the ground screaming. His cries are so loud that his divine mother Thetis hears them from beneath the ocean and comes to him. In Book 18, Achilles says, "He was more to me than all my other companions. I loved him as my own life." Later, the ghost of Patroclus appears to Achilles and asks him this specific thing: "Bury our bones together in a single urn, so that we may lie together as we were together in life." Homer doesn't call them lovers. He writes them in a way that every major author who came after him interpreted as lovers. By 500 BC, the playwright Aeschylus had written a play, Myrmidons, in which Achilles and Patroclus are explicitly in a sexual relationship. A fragment survives in which Achilles speaks of their frequent kisses. By the 380s BC, Plato, in the Symposium, one of the most celebrated philosophical texts ever written, names Achilles and Patroclus as an example of divinely approved lovers. Plato is not speculating. He is treating their relationship as established common knowledge and using it to make a philosophical argument about the nature of love. Aeschines, a 4th century Athenian orator, in a speech before the Athenian assembly, invokes Achilles and Patroclus to make an argument about same-sex love. He does this in a public legal speech, because by this point it was not controversial in Athens to say they were lovers. The film made them cousins, not because the ancient sources support that. There is no ancient source that makes them cousins, but because a 2004 Hollywood studio was not prepared to put a same-sex relationship at the center of a $185 million blockbuster. And here's why this matters beyond historical accuracy. The entire second half of the Iliad is about one thing: Achilles' grief. His uncontrollable, world-ending cosmic grief over the death of Patroclus. He withdraws from war because his honor is stolen. He returns to war because the person he loves most is dead. That grief is the engine. In the film, Patroclus is a young cousin mentee who gets killed while borrowing Achilles' armor. Achilles is upset, understandably upset. In the poem, the death of Patroclus is the thing that breaks Achilles open. He doesn't just want revenge. He wants to die. He knows that killing Hector means he will die soon after. His mother told him. He kills Hector anyway, because staying alive in a world without Patroclus is not something he can stand. That is one of the most devastating things in world literature. The film made it a revenge arc. Making them cousins was not a neutral creative decision. It was a deliberate sanitization that hollowed out the emotional core of the entire source material. And the director admitted it was about fear of controversy. In 2004, about a poem written 2,800 years ago. The Trojan Horse. Obviously, the thing Troy was always going to build toward, the reason anyone knows what a Trojan horse is. The symbol that's been borrowed by cybersecurity, poker players and gift givers with bad intentions for 3,000 years. It's not in Homer's Iliad. Not a word. The Iliad ends before the horse, the final act of the poem. The emotional resolution. Is Priam crossing enemy lines to reclaim Hector's body, and Achilles' grief giving way to something like mercy? That is where Homer ends, not with a wooden horse, not with the fall of Troy. The Trojan horse appears in Virgil's Aeneid, written around 19 BC, nearly 700 years after Homer. It also appears in a lost Greek text called the Little Iliad and in Post-Homerica by Quintus of Smyrna. Later texts, post-Homeric, filling in parts of the story Homer didn't tell. The film ends with the horse. The film basically structured its entire third act around the horse, and in doing so, it borrowed from a Roman epic from the 1st century BC, while stripping out most of the 8th century BC Greek text that was supposedly its source. And here's the specific detail that makes this even worse. In the film, Achilles is inside the Trojan horse. He rides it in. He's there for the sack of Troy. The Odyssey, Homer's own sequel to the Iliad, explicitly places Achilles' ghost in the underworld by the time Troy falls. Odysseus meets him there. Achilles died before the horse. He never saw it. The film put its most famous character inside the one device that wasn't in the original text, in an event that happened after he was dead. And while we're here, you know the scene the film could have included, the one that makes the Trojan horse moment genuinely terrifying. The Laocoon. Laocoon was a Trojan priest of Apollo. When the Greeks left the horse on the beach and sailed away, Laocoon stood in front of the assembled Trojans and said, "I fear the Greeks, even bearing gifts." He hurled a spear at the horse's flank. The crowd wavered. Then 2 enormous sea serpents rose from the waves, sent by gods who wanted Troy to fall, and strangled Laocoon and his 2 sons in front of everyone. The Trojans, witnessing this, interpreted it as divine punishment for Laocoon's skepticism. They decided the gods wanted them to accept the horse. They pulled it inside. The priest who tried to warn them died for it, and his death convinced his people to walk into the trap. That scene, a man killed by the gods for being right, is not in the film. The film has Odysseus giving a pep talk inside the horse. The Trojan War in the film lasts approximately 2 weeks. In Homer, in every ancient source, it lasted 10 years, a decade. The Iliad picks up in the 9th year, with both armies exhausted, with men who have spent most of their adult lives on a beach in Anatolia. Greek soldiers who remember what their homes looked like but can't fully picture their children's faces anymore. Men killing out of inertia as much as purpose. That psychological weight, the accumulated cost of a decade of war, is completely absent from a film that compresses the timeline. The reason Agamemnon is so grasping and cruel with Briseis is partly because he's been here for 9 years, and this war has taken everything from him. The reason Achilles is so rageful is because he is a man who has spent the bulk of his young life on this beach, and he knows he will die here. And here is the thing the film doesn't tell you. Troy was real. The city at Hisarlik in northwestern Turkey was first excavated by Heinrich Schliemann in the 1870s. Modern archaeologists now broadly accept that Hizarlik is the Troy of legend. The layer known as Troy 7a shows evidence of violent destruction around 1180 BC. Burnt deposits, burned structures, human bones buried haphazardly, and something particularly striking: a cache of slingstones, hundreds of them, found piled just outside the palace walls. Ammunition. Someone was defending that place. Did the Trojan War happen? There was almost certainly a real conflict. Whether it was exactly Homer's war, 10 years, 1,000 ships, demigods and gods, is unknowable. But something happened at Hizarlik, and the memory of it survived in oral tradition for 4 centuries until Homer wrote it down. That's the most interesting story in this whole saga. Not the myth, but the fact that the myth has a real place underneath it. The film didn't have time for that. It was busy killing Agamemnon inside Troy. Here is what Troy, 2004, did. It took one of the richest, strangest, and most structurally complex pieces of literature ever written. A poem about gods bleeding on battlefields, about a 10-year siege destroying men from the inside out, about a love so profound it makes its owner choose death. And it made it legible to a summer multiplex audience. That's not nothing. The performances are real. The spectacle is real. Hector is genuinely moving. The film introduced Homer to millions of people who'd never otherwise have gone looking. But here's what it buried: a warrior named Diomedes who stabbed the god of war and the goddess of love in a single afternoon. A Greek commander who sacrificed his own daughter to get a wind, survived a decade-long war, came home to a purple carpet, and was murdered in his bath by the wife who never forgave him. A relationship between 2 warriors so intense that Plato used it 7 centuries later as his primary example of divinely approved love. A city whose ruins still stand in Turkey, surrounded by slingstones that someone stockpiled when they knew the Greeks were coming. Hollywood completely buried this. Troy the film chose spectacle over truth. What it buried was a story even more epic, even more violent, even more human than what made it to the screen. The real Iliad doesn't end with a horse. It ends with an old man on his knees in enemy territory, and a warrior so consumed by grief that mercy is the only thing he has left. That's a better movie than Troy. Someone should make it. Which ancient myth should we tackle next? The Odyssey, the fall of Athens, the house of Atreus from the beginning? Drop it below. I read every comment.